Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Global Standards, Local Ecosystems, Identifying Ecosystem-Based Key Biodiversity Areas in British Columbia. My name is Ashley Talbot. I'm the Director of Communications here at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and we'll be hosting today's discussion. For those of you who might be new to WCS Canada, we are a national civil society organisation working across the country. Our vision is a world in which wildlife thrives in healthy lands and seas, valued by societies that embrace and benefit from the diversity and integrity of life on Earth. We work towards this through a blend of on-the-ground scientific research and policy action, developing solutions to address conservation challenges from the impacts of climate change on wildlife and wild areas to the cumulative effects of resource development and other human impacts. Before we go any further and introduce today's speakers, however, I'd like to complete a land acknowledgement, paying our respects to the Indigenous peoples and all of our relations on the lands and waters where we are privileged to live and work. WCS Canada acknowledges that this event is taking place on the traditional territory of many nations. Our organisation works across many locations across what is now known as Canada, on the ancestral and unceded territories of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples who have called this land home since time immemorial. WCS Canada is committed to affirming the importance of Indigenous peoples' perspectives in local, national, and global biodiversity conservation, and respecting the sacred relationships the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations have for their traditional territories and homelands, and the stewardship based on respect, love, responsibility, and reciprocity, which has, over countless generations, nurtured and sustained the lands, waters, plants, and animals that WCS Canada considers important today, and without this, we would not be. Thank you. I'm now very pleased to introduce our three fantastic speakers who are joining me today. Director of Conservation Strategy, Kira Rodsep-Hearn, KBA Ecosystems Criteria Coordinator, Lucy Poley, and British Columbia Ecosystem KBA Analyst, Deborah Obrist. Kira is WCS Canada's Director of Conservation Strategy and leads the Canadian Key Biodiversity Areas initiative. Lucy leads the initiative's ecosystem-based work, coordinating the development of ecosystem data and information and identification of KBAs based on rare, at-risk, or highly intact ecosystems. And Deborah is an interdisciplinary scientist working closely with Kira and Lucy to bring together data needed to identify KBAs for rare and threatened ecosystems across British Columbia. So Kira will be opening today's webinar, followed by presentations from Lucy and Deborah, respectively, after which we will have some time for Q&A. A few bits of light housekeeping before we get started in terms of how that Q&A will operate. So please supply any questions in the Q&A box that Zoom provides throughout the webinar. We'll be triaging them as we go for the Q&A at the end, so please do send them over as you think of them. This webinar is also being recorded, so you will all receive the link to that recording after the webinar. So I think that is everything from me. And without any further preamble, I'm really happy to hand over to our first speaker, Kira.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I'll just wait for the slideshow to be shared. All right, so I'm going to give you just a quick introduction to the whole Key Biodiversity Area program across Canada and a little bit in BC, because we have been doing this work for about 7 years now. But the ecosystem KBA work is quite new to a lot of people, especially in BC. We've been focusing on species for the last 7 years. And so that's the work to date really shows results around species KBAs. So it'll be interesting to share with you now the progress that we're making on ecosystem KBAs. Um, a little primer on key biodiversity areas, although a lot of people are now familiar with KBAs in Canada, and KBAs are being incorporated into work across the country at this point. But KBAs are something very specific. They are defined as sites contributing significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. And that word persistence is key. Key biodiversity areas aren't just all the places that are really important for biodiversity. They're the places that have concentrations of species or ecosystems that are vulnerable to disappearing, so to being lost from the planet or from particular ecosystems, so extirpated or even worse. And what a key biodiversity area is further laid out in a global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas and an accompanying much thicker volume called Guidelines for Using this Global Standard that lays out the data standards, the rules, data recency, all sorts of different things, who needs to be involved in this work, the review processes, etc. And we've only added to that set of guidelines in Canada. Next slide. So key biodiversity areas are identified under a set of criteria, and there are some sub-criteria under each of these criteria as well. They include key biodiversity areas for threatened biodiversity, and that includes both species and ecosystems. Geographically restricted biodiversity, again, both species and ecosystems. KBAs for ecological integrity, and these are very rare across the planet. There's only one identified so far, but our problem in Canada is the opposite, that there's going to be quite a few KBAs for ecological integrity, but we're working slowly with partners across northern Canada for the most part, and mostly First Nations and Inuit, in order to identify these sites. Criterion D is KBAs for biological processes. So you can think about this as migratory stopover sites or caribou calving grounds or salmon spawning sites. So places where species gather in enormous numbers and therefore depend on those sites in order to survive their life cycles. And then also KBAs under criterion E, which is irreplaceability, which is a quantitative approach to identifying sites of high irreplaceability based on some very specific criteria as well. We haven't actually implemented that criterion for a number of different reasons. They mostly come up with the same types of sites that the first four criteria do. Next. And the way that we're doing this work in Canada is substantial, I would say, that it's probably a more built up process than in most countries in the world. And we have a large coalition. It's open to anybody. We have a lot of people who are participating in the work, including thousands of experts at this point and knowledge holders, but also people following the work, using the information, using the data for planning purposes, etc. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. There's a secretariat, and that's WCS Canada, as well as Birds Canada and NatureServe Canada, as well as a lot of organizations that are provincially based. For example, in BC, BC Nature is a very important partner in this work. We are also tied to the global KBA partnership. So the work is standardized across the globe. Next slide. So just quickly before we move on to the meat of this meeting, which is really about ecosystems, I just wanted to say that we're quite excited by the fact that KBAs are being used everywhere. They're really a building block for biodiversity conservation in Canada. There's something for people to gather around because of what KBAs represent. But they can be used for planning in terms of protected areas and OECMs, and that is already they're being incorporated into federal plans as well as provincial and territorial plans. You can probably just load up all the rest of these as well, but they're being used in land use planning, application of the mitigation hierarchy, which is in line with the new nature strategy that was just released a couple of weeks ago. They're being used to focus stewardship work or funding for stewardship work because these are the places where biodiversity loss is most likely to happen. And so they're also being used, especially in BC, in fact, to support Indigenous-led conservation as a supporting value. They're not always at the center of why specific areas are being identified as Indigenous and protected and conserved areas. So the main question that KBAs help to answer is, are we targeting areas of importance for biodiversity with our conservation actions? And these you could think of as sort of the first stop. You should be aware of these sites. Maybe you want to work in other areas for other reasons, and that's absolutely valid. They don't capture all the values of biodiversity, but they are places where stopping and reversing biodiversity loss, it's ground zero for that. And so to be aware of them across the whole country and in your own province is pretty key. So they're a strong tool in Canada's toolbox. They're not the only tool, but the reason that people find them to be very appealing is that they're standardized, quantitative, and transparent. There's no black box there. Often when we have data sets for important areas or higher replaceability, maybe the people who've done the analysis know exactly what went into it, but it's not always clear to all other partners what went into it. So it's very accessible to everybody. You can search, filter, and download data on the KBA website. right there. KBAs draw attention to sites that are important for halting and reversing biodiversity loss in particular, but they don't prescribe how sites should be managed. So they're not the same as protected areas, they're not OECMs, but they might be good targets for being protected areas or OECMs if that's the appropriate way to manage the KBA by a community in a particular place. So we think that other data sets are also needed. So we need to capture all the values that are important to people and to communities in BC. KBAs are not the only thing, but they're a very important part. And probably if we are developing other data sets to complement KBAs, they should also be transparent, commonly understood, and accessible to everybody. And so this is my final slide. This is the map of KBAs in BC to date. This is just, you have to keep this in mind. They're only for species to date. So these are KBAs identified under criteria A1, B1, and D1. Hundreds of BC experts have contributed to identifying these sites. Dozens of First Nations are participating directly in this work through our partnership with BC Nature and through our Indigenous Outreach Coordinator, as well as the work of the Indigenous Advisory Committee for KBAs. There's been a lot of support from the BC government. This is one of many webinars that we've given in BC. Sometimes they're organized directly by the BC government. Thank you to them. Thank you to a number of BC-based foundations, including the Sitka Foundation, but others as well. And BC Parks Foundation is funding this particular work, which we'll talk about in a minute. And special thanks to our partner at BC Nature as well. So we'll move on immediately to talking about ecosystem KBAs in BC, which is very exciting.
Okay, hi everybody. This is my part now. So now that you've seen an overview of how the KBA program as a whole works, I'm going to walk you through ecosystem KBAs in particular. So what the process is and what information we need to identify them. Generally, ecosystem KBAs can be thought of as representing areas with concentrations of rare or threatened ecosystem types. And there are two criteria within the KBA standard that focus on these types of sites. The first is criterion A2, which focuses on threatened ecosystem types. Within an A2 KBA, we need to have either at least 5% of the extent of a critically endangered or endangered ecosystem type, or at least 10% of the extent of a vulnerable ecosystem type. The other criterion is B4, which focuses on geographically restricted ecosystem types. These don't have to be assessed as threatened, but within a B4 site, we need to hold at least 20% of the extent of any ecosystem type. Now, when it comes to understanding what an ecosystem type is and conceptualizing that, there are lots of different ways to do that. But for KBA purposes, we do follow a fairly specific approach to understand ecosystems. And in this approach, first, the ecosystem type needs to be classified at an appropriate level in a consistent hierarchical classification framework. The full extent of the ecosystem needs to be mapped everywhere that it occurs in the world or in Canada. For those A2 KBAs dealing with threatened ecosystems, we need to assess the risk of collapse of the ecosystem using a quantitative threat assessment method. And finally, at any potential KBA site, we need to check, does the amount of the total ecosystem extent within the site's boundaries meet those thresholds I showed you on the previous slide? And the goal of this very standardized approach for ecosystem KBAs is to develop a consistent understanding of what ecosystem KBAs and the ecosystem data that underlies them represents everywhere in the world that they're identified. So even though characteristics of different ecosystems can be very different, an ecosystem KBA conceptually is the same thing whether it's here in BC or in Nova Scotia or in South Africa or in Mozambique. So now I'm going to walk you through each of the pieces of information that we need and let you know how we are deriving this information for use here in Canada. And the first is ecosystem classification, probably the most complex piece of all. The ecosystem type needs to be classified at an appropriate level in a consistent hierarchical framework. If we look at this definition of ecosystem type in the KBA standard, it tells us that it is a defined ecosystem unit for standard and repeatable assessment at an intermediate level in a globally consistent ecosystem classification hierarchy. So really important things here are standard, repeatable, and consistent, and then targeting that intermediate level, which I'll show you in a second. We can define an ecosystem type by variables related to its living species, non-living aspects of the environment, interactions between these, and the physical space in which they operate. Now, what we found here in Canada is that in general, for ecosystem type classification for KBA purposes, our best approach is to follow ecosystem expert advice on how to bring together pieces of information from various existing national and provincial classification systems while keeping an eye on making sure we have that international level consistency the standard requires. One of the tools we have at hand is called the Canadian National Vegetation Classification. And although this is a national framework for classification, it does align with those globally consistent approaches. So that's great. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Essentially, it is a hierarchy, which means that the lower levels, several different types of ecosystems are nested within the level above them, and it builds up on itself. At the upper levels, it's very broad, it's very generalized. At the lower level, it's very localized and detailed. I'm going to show you what that actually looks like with the names of a particular ecosystem from top to bottom in the hierarchy. So let's take a look at a coastal Garry Oak Douglas fir type of ecosystem. As the names fill out from top to bottom, you can see at the biome level, we're talking extremely broad and generalized, the temperate boreal forest and woodland biome. Conversely, at the association level at the bottom, we're getting very specific and very local. Douglas fir, Garry Oak, Alaska onion grass forest. So it's actually the specific species that occur together in a place. And I think seeing the names of the ecosystems here drives home why we're targeting those intermediate levels for KBA purposes. At these upper levels, we're talking very generalized and broad, and there's a lot of different subtypes nested within these levels that are equally important, but also different. So it would be challenging to identify a particular conservation site at this broad level. Conversely, at the very detailed level, we're talking so localized and specific, it would be hard to even know that we've fully mapped this, let alone identify a site containing a certain amount of this ecosystem type. So really that sweet spot is those intermediate levels, and experts in Canada have told us that we should be targeting the group to alliance level in CNVC depending on the ecosystem type. And one little hiccup here is that the CNVC is actually still in progress. It's still being developed, so not all ecosystem types are defined and fleshed out at these levels for all of the ecosystems we're interested in KBAs. It's a good starting point, but it's not complete yet. However, in Canada, a lot of provinces actually maintain their own provincial ecosystem classifications, and BC has a great one. It's called BEC, the Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification. I'm not going to talk a lot about it now because Deb will explain it in a few minutes, but what I can say that although it's not a globally consistent system, so we can't directly pull information from it and immediately make KBAs, it is great for understanding provincial detail and broad patterns in ecosystems. So again, what we're really trying to do here is look at these existing tools, bring together ecosystem information from them, pass it through the filter of expert advice, and use that to develop these intermediate level ecosystem type classifications for ecosystems we're interested in evaluating for KBAs. The next step in the process is ecosystem mapping. What we want to know is what's the full extent of the ecosystem. This is the current global or national area of geographic distribution, representing all spatial occurrences of that ecosystem type. And in Canada, there are some existing ecosystem maps, and as long as they're up to date and accurate in Canada, we can use them. Where we need to fill gaps, we can use spatial analysis methods guided by expert input on how best to do so to assess the full distribution of any of these ecosystems we're interested in. So what data do exist so far? Well, there is some continental scale mapping. It tends to extend the distribution of ecosystems in the US that are shared with Canada up into southern Canada. Because of this, we've evaluated this map and found that its kind of American-centric focus means it's less accurate in the Canadian parts of the distribution. So it's a good starting place, but not a final tool. There are national level maps associated with the CNVC in progress, and we've started to use them elsewhere, but they're not fully complete yet. And again, there's often provincial information available. In BC, we have the biogeoclimatic zone map, which covers the full province at a fairly coarse level. And then the Species Conservation Data Center also maintains very detailed locations on specific ecological communities. So once again, we see broad provincial patterns or fine detail, but these are not nationally consistent classifications. And it's also, as you can see in that note, they're not always comprehensive. So it doesn't always represent the ecosystem everywhere that it occurs. So where we see gaps in this, we can use spatial methodologies, pulling data from field information and remote sensing, put it through some predictive modeling, ask experts if we're approaching it correctly, and fill in gaps to understand the full map of the ecosystem extent. The next step is ecosystem threat assessment. The ecosystem risk of collapse is what we're looking for. And ecosystems are really interesting because unlike species, when they're gone, they don't go extinct. We say they collapse. And what that means is they transform an identity, they lose defining features, and they are replaced ultimately by a different ecosystem type in the same place. This step is not necessary for B4 KBAs, but it is necessary for that criterion A2 on looking at threatened ecosystem types. So ecosystem threat status or risk of collapse in some cases can be informed by existing statuses where ecosystems have already been assessed and the statuses are accurate, up to date, and consistent. Or we can use methods that are already established to complete new threat assessments. These quantitative threat assessment frameworks typically use criteria to evaluate the risk of ecosystem collapse, and if the risk is high, assign ecosystems to a threatened category, either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. Some of the tools we have available for us is the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. It's a global threat assessment framework. And then the organization NatureServe maintains biodiversity data in North America, and they've developed a continental scale ranking system as well. Finally, BC does also maintain a provincial level, what they call Red List, with very similar ranks at the provincial scale to the NatureServe conservation ranks. With all of these systems, typically what you can look is from the bottom to the top. Each category has an increasing level of risk of collapse for the ecosystem in question. To assess risk of collapse, we typically look at criteria based on characteristics of the ecosystem, like past or potential range reduction, geographic restriction, ecosystem rarity, and current or future threats to that ecosystem type. So far, there aren't very many completed ecosystem threat assessments in Canada at that classification level that we're targeting for KBAs. But with these frameworks, they essentially provide the methodology to conduct a threat assessment as long as we have the appropriate ecosystem data. So in some cases, we can conduct new threat assessments using these methods when we think that an ecosystem may qualify for criterion A2 because it is threatened. Finally, the last thing we need to do is at each potential site, check the amount of the ecosystem within it. We want to know, does the percentage of the global or national extent of that ecosystem type that lies within the site boundaries meet those relevant thresholds that I showed you early on for the ecosystem type and whether we're looking at criterion A2 or B4. So I'm going to give you an example of what this would look like in practice if we have all the data. Now, this is not real data, so please do not consider this a real KBA. It's just a demonstration of what we would do to actually make the site given the ecosystem data that we need. So let's look at this little map around Victoria, and let's say that the gold blobs on this map represent the distribution of a very rare ecosystem type in the world. And let's look at one of these patches up close and say, I wonder if that could be a KBA. So first of all, we need to check our ecosystem data. Is it classified at the correct level? Yes, this imaginary ecosystem is classified at the group level, which is appropriate for ecosystem KBAs. Okay, good. It is globally critically endangered, so it could qualify as an A2 KBA given a site contains at least 5% of the total extent within the boundaries. So if we do some looking at the extent, it's very rare. There's only 3.7 kilometers squared of this imaginary ecosystem in the whole world. This particular site that we're looking at contains 0.41 kilometers squared. Doing our math, we find that this site contains 11% of that ecosystem's distribution. It meets global A2. Excellent. So what our final step in this process would be is to propose a KBA. So we would delineate a manageable and ecologically relevant site boundary. It might look something like this around this little park that contains the ecosystem in question, and then we would propose it as a KBA and send it through our detailed review process before it's published. So overall, what I hope that you take away from this is that really the strength of ecosystem KBAs is that they are globally standardized and they are quantitatively derived. So this develops a shared, consistent, and very transparent understanding of significant sites for ecosystem conservation everywhere in the world that they are identified. They are conceptually the same thing. An ecosystem KBA, any KBA, represents the culmination of a very collaborative and rigorous process. It uses the best available data we have alongside significant expert input. So you can rest assured that once a KBA is published on their KBA Canada registry, lots of people have looked at it to check that we're using the best data for the ecosystem and for that site. a KBA will remain a KBA as long as those criteria thresholds continue to be met. And this is regardless of land tenure or changes within the site. But as Kira said, this is ultimately information. It's not a prescription. So stewardship actions, if needed, can be tailored to each particular site's needs and priorities and the priorities of the rights and stakeholders on that site. But I do think it needs to be mentioned that ecosystem KBAs ultimately are one tool. They cannot do everything for every conservation value. They are designed to identify those sites, as you've seen, that contain that minimum amount of the total extent of threatened or geographically restricted ecosystem types. This means that they may not capture all locally important individual ecosystem patches or broad landscapes if these don't meet those KBA criteria thresholds at the scale of a site. But we do emphasize that these and other values, such as ecosystem services, an ecosystem with cultural significance that might be prioritized either by communities near these places or by other conservation organizations, these are still valuable. And we very much believe that they should be identified and safeguarded using other conservation approaches. It's just that the KBA approach might not be the right tool for this particular job. So finally, I'm going to walk you through our status of ecosystem KBAs in Canada so far. What have we identified? Over in Manitoba, there's a very rare ecosystem type called the Northern Plains alvar. It's only found in central Manitoba in the whole world. So we've identified the Marble Ridge alvar KBA, shown there the black boundary. Within the site shown in orange, it contains 64% of all of this ecosystem in the world, so it's a global B4 site. In Nova Scotia, there's a rare forest type called the Acadian karst forest. We've identified the Cape Breton karst forest KBA, again shown with the black boundary. This KBA contains 30% of this ecosystem type in the world, and so it's another global B4 site. Finally, in Ontario, there are 3 ecosystems that we've identified KBAs for so far: the Great Lakes alvar, the very related alvar woodland, and Great Lakes dunes. So you can see up in gold across southern Ontario, there are 3 Great Lakes alvar sites. In pink, 2 alvar woodland sites, and down at the bottom in blue, 1 Great Lakes dune site. And these represent a mix of global A2 and B4 and national B4 ecosystem KBAs. So that's where we're at across the country so far. Now, how are we applying this complicated process here in BC? Well, for that, I'm going to turn you over to my colleague, Deb. She's been working on this for about 9 months now, and she is going to tell you all about it. Thank you.
Sorry, I lost my Zoom window and couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Hi everyone, I'm Deb, and as Ashley mentioned, my role with WCS Canada is the BC Ecosystem KBA Analyst. What I want to present to you today is the progress of my work to identify sites in BC that have nationally or even globally significant concentrations of ecosystems that might qualify as ecosystem key biodiversity areas. Before I start, I also just want to say that this work is being done in close collaboration with Cora Skane and Jason Straka from the BC Conservation Data Center Ecology team, and that this work is benefiting a lot from their expertise. BC is a uniquely challenging place to apply ecosystem KBAs. Between the mountains and the long coastline, there are really strong climatic and elevational gradients, which create a really exceptional diversity of ecosystems. Many of these ecosystems are rare, threatened, or otherwise unique. Although we have some really good ecosystem information available in BC, particularly through that BEC program, or the Bioclimatic Ecosystem Classification Program, we currently don't have clear, spatially explicit information on where the most significant patches of these ecosystems are, or how to prioritize them for conservation. And ecosystem KBAs can help with that. They identify sites that have globally significant amounts of particular ecosystems, which can help in prioritizing conservation efforts, or on the flip side, they can also tell us where development might have more negative impacts. BC's ecosystem diversity, combined with the strength of its ecosystem data, also make it an important place to advance ecosystem KBA methods with lessons that can inform the broader KBA program beyond just the province. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, what do ecosystem KBAs add to the tools that we already have in BC? Well, they fill a pretty specific gap in BC's conservation toolbox, and it's important to note that they're not intended to replace existing tools. What they offer is ecosystem level prioritization. So most existing approaches in the province are either species focused or individual site focused. Ecosystem KBAs explicitly highlight ecosystems that are rare, threatened, or geographically restricted. They bring a transparent, quantitative way to identify those ecosystems, and they use a consistent global framework. So that means BC's ecosystems can be identified in a way that's repeatable and comparable across Canada or across the world, which is something that provincial tools currently don't do. Ecosystem KBAs aren't intended to be the only conservation tool. They're not a prescription. They just add an additional layer of information that can help everybody to make better informed decisions. But some of the same reasons that BC is high priority for ecosystem KBAs also make the work challenging. So I'll first just give you a general rundown of each of these issues, and then I'll get into them in a bit more detail over the next few slides. The first challenge is that our topography in BC is really complex. It creates a really heterogeneous landscape. And to account for this, BC ecologists built the highly detailed bioclimatic ecosystem classification system, which captures that complexity specifically for British Columbia. It's absolutely necessary to use in this landscape, but it doesn't line up very neatly with the Canadian National Vegetation Classification, which is required for ecosystem KBAs here. The second challenge is that the spatial data at the required spatial scale are incomplete or inconsistent. So most of the mapping that we have was created for forestry or other major project assessments, not with the goal of quantifying ecosystem extents for ecological purposes, unfortunately. So there are a lot of gaps. And finally, for those ecosystems that might meet that A2 criterion for threatened ecosystems, threat assessments in BC are done at a different scale and for different purposes than what the KBA standard requires, so we can't use them directly. So to get into a bit more detail here, this section can be a bit technical, but I'll walk through it in the way that I understand it as an end user. As Lucy mentioned, for ecosystem KBAs, we work with the Canadian National Vegetation Classification, which is organized into those upper, mid, and lower levels. At the uppermost level, biomes represent groups that are as broad as temperate forests and woodlands, and they have global distributions. At lower levels, it represents very specific plants that occur together. For example, the Western Red Cedar Salmonberry Plant Association, which is red listed or threatened in BC. For ecosystem KBAs, which we're assessing at the national scale, we need ecosystems classified somewhere in the middle. In practice, this means using CNVC groups for non-forested ecosystems and alliances for forested ones. Ecosystems we consider for KBAs don't have to be formally defined in the CNVC itself, but what matters is that the ecosystem concepts that we use match those levels so that we can be consistent in our mapping and our assessments across Canada. In BC, the CNVC is not widely used by ecologists. Most BC ecosystems haven't been formally described in that system. Instead, we primarily use the Bioclimatic Ecosystem Classification System. From now on, I'm just going to call it BEC. So the CNVC is a solely vegetation classification system. It's entirely focused on classifying plant communities. BEC also has a vegetation classification component, and to that part of BEC is conceptually a very close match to the CNVC hierarchy. Both systems include levels like plant alliances and plant associations, so on paper they line up pretty well. But BEC isn't just a vegetation classification. There's that vegetation part, but there's also a climate classification component that represents the climate regime and therefore the potential vegetation an area could support. And there's a site classification, which shows how local conditions like slope, aspect, soils, hydrology, and substrate shape the actual vegetation that you see on the ground. So when you put these three pieces together, BEC can capture ecological patterns at a level of detail that actually fit BC's landscapes. One challenge here is that a lot of these pieces are only conceptual. Only a few of the components here are actually described or mapped. Those are the ones that I'm showing here in black boxes. There is correlation work happening to link site series back to plant association, but it's not complete. So that creates a lot of uncertainty when we try to translate the available BEC units into those mid-level vegetation ecosystem concepts that we need for ecosystem KBAs. This is something that we're working through with provincial ecologists and other experts to figure out how to best address that disconnect between the CNVC and BEC on a case-by-case basis. When it comes to spatial data, we do have full coverage of BC in the climate classification portion. So this here is a map of the BEC subzone variants. Again, these are the broader scale potential vegetation patterns that are based on regional climates, and they're a bit too broad to be used directly in ecosystem KBA work. We do have some coverage at the smaller scale at site series, so this is probably the closest thing that we have to mapping plant associations, but as you can see, the coverage isn't complete. Most of these data are in the form of terrestrial ecosystem mapping data, also known as TEM, which is made by looking at aerial or satellite imagery of an area and drawing polygons around areas that look like they contain the same types of ecosystems. These are assigned codes, which usually line up with site series in some way. And then finally, there's usually a ground truthing stage where some of the areas are checked with field plots to make sure that the ecosystem labels were properly assigned. This is the go-to data that I first check to see if I'll have enough data to even consider ecosystem KBAs. As I'll explain in a few slides, we're overcoming the challenge of limited data by incorporating other relevant data sources on a case-by-case basis, and also by creating some of our own data sets. And then there's that third challenge, which is about how threat status assessments are done in BC. So this is only relevant for those ecosystems that might meet the A2 criterion for threatened ecosystems. In BC, the Conservation Data Centre is the main body that conducts these status assessments. They work at the level of ecological community, which is roughly equal to BEC plant associations. They use nature-served methods, and they consider threats, trends, and the range extents to assign a sub-regional S rank, which is then translated to that BC red, blue, and yellow list that you might be familiar with. So the main issue here is that there's a scale mismatch. The CDC evaluates ecosystems at the plant association level, which is very fine, kind of specific plants that occur together. But national KBA criteria require assessments at a higher level, at the alliance or group level, which combines multiple different plant associations together. There's also a geographic mismatch. The CDC assessments are provincial, so they consider the range and the status of the ecosystem in BC. KBAs can be either national or global, so they require evaluating ecosystems at minimum across their full Canadian extent. Because of this, we're conducting some of our own ecosystem status assessments to align the KBA standard. I'll show you some examples of ecosystems where we're doing this in a few slides. So when I first started this work, I met with several different people, including provincial ecologists, as well as other experts, and they pointed me towards a couple of ecosystems of high conservation priority that seemed especially promising for ecosystem KBAs. These gave us the opportunity to look for ways to get through those challenges that I talked about and figure out a process using real ecosystems. So these are the ones that came up repeatedly, and for each of these ecosystems, we're at different stages of going through the same basic process. The process involves a number of steps. The first step, which is quite time-consuming, is to define the ecosystem. We're doing this in close consultation with BC experts, provincial ecologists, regional experts, and people who know the systems on the ground. We want to make really sure that whatever ecosystem concept that we use is grounded in BEC. If there's not a CNVC concept that aligns with BEC, we can work with experts to figure out which site series can reasonably be considered together at that higher level. So that would give us an equivalent mid-level ecosystem concept that aligns with BEC, but also still fits the structure required for KBAs. So once we have agreement on an equivalent concept, we can write it up and have it reviewed by experts. Next, we need to make sure that we have sufficient spatial data coverage to estimate the ecosystem's range extent in Canada. If we have those two things, we can look for eligible sites that meet the criteria that Lucy described for B4, geographically restricted ecosystems. If we find a patch that has enough of the national extent of that ecosystem, we can propose a KBA. But if we don't find an eligible site big enough, we can check to see if a status assessment has been done on the ecosystem at the national scale. So for most BC ecosystems, these haven't been done, but we can do one ourselves. If the ecosystem is threatened at the national level, we can revisit our search for eligible sites and include smaller ones. If it's not threatened at this point, the ecosystem is not eligible for KBA status. If we do find a site large enough to qualify under that A2 criterion for threatened ecosystems, we can propose an ecosystem KBA. And if we still can't find a site of that size, then no KBA is possible for that ecosystem. So next, I'll go through some of those ecosystems that I've been working on to show you how far along I am in this process. Okay, so starting with Pacific estuarine meadows and marshes. This is a non-forested ecosystem, so we need an equivalent concept at the CNVC group level. And in this case, we actually do have a CNVC group that fits pretty well. It's called the Temperate Pacific Salt Marsh, and it captures the full range of estuarine meadows and marshes that we have in BC, essentially all the ED and EM units in the NBEC system. So for this ecosystem, the definition step was relatively straightforward. Once we had the ecosystem concept defined, the next step was to look at the spatial data. So we started with the Terrestrial Ecosystem Mapping, or TEM, from BC Government's Terrestrial Ecosystems Inventory. And as I mentioned earlier, TEM has historically been developed for forestry and major project applications, so those non-forested ecosystems like estuarine meadows tended to receive less emphasis. So as a result, a lot of large estuaries actually don't have TEM coverage at all, and even some mapped estuaries have gaps. So in this example here, you can see the blue polygons. These show where TEM identifies estuarine meadows or marsh, but we can see clearly that there are additional areas around it that likely also support the same ecosystem. To address the data gap, we also brought in a second data set, the Pacific Estuary Conservation Program layer. It covers most of the major estuaries in the province, and it's a really useful complement to TEM. But it's also really broad. It includes rivers, open water, the entirety of what might be considered the estuary. So while we still can't rely on it alone to identify estuarine meadows and marshes, it is useful. But to actually map the ecosystem properly, we had to combine these sources. We also included data from Nature Trust BC, where it was available, and filled in the rest of the gaps ourselves. So a lot of this mapping ended up involving going through imagery and delineating the polygons manually. It's not perfect, but when it's finished, it'll be a big improvement on what currently exists. And once we finalize the data set, we also plan to publish it so that others can use it too. Once we have the extent mapped, the next step will be to look for sites that might meet KBA criteria. So for estuarine meadows and marshes, the distribution is extremely patchy, and it's unlikely that any single site contains enough of the total Canadian extent needed for the B4 criterion. But the CNVC group, the Temperate Pacific Salt Marsh, is globally listed as imperiled, as G2. So this opens the door for criterion A2 for threatened ecosystem. So our plan is to conduct a national scale threat status assessment to see what the status of this ecosystem is just in Canada, with the goal of seeing if some sites in BC qualify under A2, even if they don't meet that B4 threshold. So overall, for this ecosystem, we have a concept that's defined. We're finalizing the spatial data. We're about to start looking for eligible sites and also to do that status assessment. I'll move on to another ecosystem that we've been focusing on, the Garry Oak Woodland. So these are oak-dominated ecosystems that have been culturally stewarded for thousands of years. They've experienced significant declines since colonization due to urban development, fire suppression, invasive species. For this ecosystem, the appropriate CNVC alliance wasn't immediately clear. Through discussions with BC provincial ecologists, we identified these two site series as the best representatives of the ecosystem. These two were actually just published in the new Coast Guide earlier this year, so the timing lined up really well. We've written a draft ecosystem concept based on these, and we're currently in the review process with that. We've also started putting together the spatial data for these. One of the reasons that we chose this ecosystem in the first place is because there is good data coverage across the range of this ecosystem. So we thought it might be a good ecosystem to test our process. So we pulled together the relevant TEM projects. We're having to look at each polygon pretty carefully because a lot of land use change has happened since some of these projects were created. So for example, this pink polygon here, you can see the Victoria Airport right over here. It's mapped as Garry Oak habitat in temp, but when you look at current imagery, a lot of the area has been developed or converted to agriculture. So part of this work involves just checking every polygon, deciding if it still represents the ecosystem or not, or if it needs to be removed or maybe redrawn. And so overall, the data extent is really good, but some of the data are just a little bit old. The two plant associations in this concept are both also on BC CDC's red list, which means they're recognized as highly threatened. Because of that, we might also choose to do a higher level national status assessment to see if we can look for smaller sites under the A2 criterion for threatened ecosystems. So for this ecosystem, we're getting close. Once the definition is finalized and we finish reviewing the spatial data, we'll be able to start identifying sites. Okay, so there's a couple other ecosystems that are also currently underway. High elevation grasslands and antelope brush, sagebrush steppes are still in the early stages. So for these, we're working on finalizing those ecosystem concepts and figuring out if we would even have enough data available to consider an ecosystem KBA. Coastal floodplain forests are a little bit further along. These are high bench riparian forests with big conifers. They're mapped pretty well, likely because there is timber value. We've identified the relevant BEC site series and we're reviewing 10 projects to estimate the extent. It's a patchy ecosystem, probably threatened, so we might also do a status assessment here to explore the A2 potential. Another ecosystem that's been suggested for follow-up is old growth forest. So old growth forests are a major conservation priority in BC. We fully recognize that they have a lot of ecological significance. However, forested ecosystem KBAs operate at a very specific classification level, the CNVC Alliance. And the KBA standard doesn't include growth phase or age class or productivity or things like that within its ecosystem criteria. So because old growth is an age class rather than an ecosystem classification type in the way that it's defined in the KBA standard, it doesn't map cleanly onto that KBA framework. It doesn't mean that these ecosystems aren't important for biodiversity. It just means that ecosystem KBAs might not be the most directly aligned tool for recognizing or protecting old growth forests. We're in ongoing discussions with BC provincial ecologists who are looking at ways to group old growth forests as separate ecosystem units. This work is still in development, and once those groupings are more clear, we'll have a better understanding of if they could potentially line up with the KBA ecosystem criteria. If they don't, we strongly encourage the use of other conservation tools for this type of ecosystem. So for our next steps, we're going to continue having a lot of conversations with ecosystem experts on ecosystem classification and refining ecosystem concepts. We're going to keep reviewing and improving spatial data, finding new sources where needed, and curating and modifying existing data where necessary. For ecosystems where the A2 criterion seems promising, we plan to do some national ecosystem status assessments, and we hope to propose several ecosystem KBAs by next winter. So there's a lot left to do. We're making steady progress. As you can see, it's a kind of a complicated process, but we're working hard with provincial experts and ecologists to make sure that our application of this standardized framework is actually feasible and useful for BC. And once you start doing ecosystem KBA work, a lot of other benefits follow. So one of these benefits is improvement in ecosystem classification. The Garry Oak work, for example, has sparked conversations between ecosystem experts in BC, Washington, Oregon, and California about updating Garry Oak alliances in the CNVC. Our work requires updating spatial layers to match present-day land use and ecosystem extent, and we intend to share all spatial layers that we create with the broader conservation community. Some of these will likely also be used to improve future status assessments through the BC CDC. And because of this, this work brings together government, experts, and NGOs and strengthens collaboration, which should ultimately improve conservation planning across BC. So I want to say many thanks to the BC Parks Foundation for funding this project, as well as the Sitka Foundation, who have supported our work in BC for many years. Thanks also to the ecologists in the Ministry of Forests, as well as Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship for your help with ecosystem classification and spatial data inquiries. Another enormous thank you to our BC CDC collaborators, Cora and Jason. And finally, thank you all for taking time to come out today to learn about our work on ecosystem KBAs in BC.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Deborah. Just wait a second for our speakers to rejoin us so we can get into the Q&A. Hi, Lucy. Kira, are you still with us? Fabulous. Here we go. Great. Okay, so we've got some great questions coming in. Thank you for your presentations. So we're going to kick things off with a bit of a kind of overview question. So could you speak a bit more to the value of national or global classification systems for conservation within BC specifically? So what's the value in doing all this extra work to develop this when there are good provincial classifications used in conservation? And what's the value of these sort of global or national products to BC practitioners?
I'm happy to start with that one. Thank you. It's a great question. It's something that comes up in other jurisdictions as well. I do think BC has developed some really great provincially specific tools, and there probably are conservation applications where that's all you need. But ultimately, I think there's one big benefit to having these consistent ways of characterizing the landscape beyond the boundaries of a particular jurisdiction. I think it's really valuable to say this ecosystem or this species is rare within BC, but if you have a framework that extends beyond those boundaries, you can assess, is it rare nationally or is it rare globally? And that really lends an additional layer of conservation significance if it's rare, not just at the provincial level, but at the global or national level, then we can really understand suddenly it's even more valuable and important to protect things that when we understand their full extent. So I think having provincial information is great, but really we're never going to know exactly how rare things are if we don't, or common and vice versa, if we don't look at the full extent of where they occur. And to do so, we need these really consistent characteristics or ways of characterizing landscapes that do extend beyond jurisdictional boundaries.
Super. Thank you, Lucy. Okay, so next question. So Deb, I think we're coming to you for this one. The focus seems to be on terrestrial ecosystems. What about coastal wetlands that are periodically covered with tidal events, but also contain specific plant associations?
Yes, the focus was on terrestrial ecosystems to begin. I think this was mostly because the classification system, they're a bit more developed for those, at least to the best of my understanding. I am open to considering more coastal ecosystems. For that particular case where they are sometimes flooded tidally, diurnally, or like a couple times a day, those probably would qualify as estuarine marshes, and those ones are ecosystems that we're considering specifically.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Lucy, coming to you next, I think. How much of a driver is apex predator species decline for ecosystem collapse in Canadian KBAs?
For sure. So if you remember my discussion of those ecosystem threat assessment frameworks, they are quantitatively driven and they look at characteristics of an ecosystem. So if species are part of an ecosystem, they're part of its characteristics. If an apex predator that is a characteristic of a particular ecosystem is declining, we have data on that, and it's that would be a decline in ecosystem condition. So I can't say like how much weight that would carry, and it kind of depends on the ecosystem and depends on the quantitative information on decline, but for sure it is a factor that we can take into account as essentially a loss of a characteristic and a loss of function of that ecosystem. So we would for sure consider species as part of the function of an ecosystem and use them to measure decline or collapse.
Super, thank you. Here we go. So someone has commented, I'm surprised that you would consider old growth as a potential category. I would expect, for example, old growth within a globally rare forest such as rainforest, coastal, inland. Building on that, how are you thinking about condition within a forest type? There is obviously conversion, e.g. in your CDF example, but harvest results in significant degradation, leading to potential ecosystem collapse. Does that fit in these considerations? Who'd like to come in on that?
I can start, but maybe with some support from Kira. I think we're considering them in the context of we're still in discussions with BC provincial ecologists about how these ecosystems might be grouped in a way that fits the KBA standard. But in the context of whether or not we're considering the condition of the ecosystem, I think that will be more important when we come to delineating ecosystems. I'm not sure if there's anything in the standard that allows for considering the condition. I think as long as it's still in that classification, it would still quantify or still qualify. But maybe I'll let Kira or Lucy touch on that too.
I can start. Certainly, old growth forests in and of themselves wouldn't qualify as KBAs. They have to be old growth components of specific ecosystems classified at the right level. So you are correct. But yeah, and as Andy Plumtree commented as well, who's part of the global KBA Secretariat, old growth forests can be part also of criterion C KBAs, which are sites of high ecological integrity. We have been struggling with this idea of ecosystem condition. We do not want to delineate sites, even if they are the last remaining sites of a particular type of ecosystem, if they are incredibly degraded and you need to, so we've been looking at that a lot in prairie ecosystems in other parts of Canada and trying to identify places that are the best high quality and intact and unfragmented sites for particular ecosystems that meet thresholds. And that said, we can also identify places that they may or may not meet KBA criteria, but we're identifying all sorts of other places for other conservation uses, for example, for restoration, that these are some very important places for restoration. I don't know if Lucy wants to add anything to that. Okay.
Super, thank you both. So jumping into a question around ecosystem KBA classification. So land managers of these ecosystems do not need to do anything for their sites to be considered for the ecosystem KBA classification. Is that right? Okay, we've got nods all round. So
Sorry,
we're gonna.
yes, we will. As we are considering the full extent of these ecosystems, all potential sites that are classified as an ecosystem type will be considered. I think we're always open to hearing from people if they have information about a particular site or a particular ecosystem type that they think could be potentially considered for KBA purposes, but there's no need to nominate your own site for anything if it is within one of these ecosystem types we're evaluating.
And then on the flip side, though, we do reach out to all stakeholders and rights holders as early in the process as possible to make sure that people are aware that there is a site that could be meeting KBA criteria in their territories, whether or not they own it or not. But certainly we are in touch to get feedback and to make people aware.
Super, thank you guys. Can other knowledge systems be included in the KBA assessment? Are there opportunities for non-quantitative data to be considered?
I can take this one. Ultimately, in the review of individual sites, we take into account other knowledge systems for sure, but as far as driving the data side of these ecosystem KBAs as well as the species KBAs, typically they are very quantitatively based. That being said, the criterion C KBA that we've talked about a few times, the ecological integrity KBA, that's looking for large, almost landscapes that are very intact and very high ecological integrity, very healthy, that has a lot more flexibility within it to start looking at some of this quantitative information, culturally significant information, because we are ultimately looking to take into account everything that makes a landscape healthy, and that includes, the people who live within it and their knowledge and understanding of health and their priorities for these places. So in most of the KBAs, they're fairly quantitatively driven, although we can incorporate comments on sites themselves. But yeah, criterion C KBAs have the most flexibility to use other knowledge systems.
We are very much kind of running to time, so I think we are probably going to have to close it there. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and for such a productive and lively discussion. I can see that the Q&A box is very much popping. So for any questions we were unable to get to today or any we weren't able to speak to immediately, and that critically haven't been submitted anonymously and have names attached to them, we will endeavour to come back to you via email with answers on those as soon as possible. But in the meantime, please do have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you're joining us from, and we very much look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.